Welcome back to another episode of Vancouver Real. I am your host today, Andy Zaremba, and with me today for the first time, a new co-host because my little brother Mike is off in Peru doing his shamanistic adventures. We have Chris Solichuk. Welcome to
Excellent.
Vancouver Real.
Hello, happy to be here.
Excellent. And as usual, we are recording out of Float House at 70 West Cordova Street, located in Gastown. We are Vancouver's largest sensory deprivation and flotation center. And we also have a location in Kitsilano, in South Surrey and Victoria. And hopefully soon we'll be announcing Edmonton, but we haven't made that official yet. And if you'd like to try it out, use the promo code RECOVERY, and that will get you a 20% discount on a single float. And as always, we would like to shout out Omed Pacman. He is the brains behind the operation here. He does all the technical work, and he'll clean up the audio file when we're finished with it. And Omed runs a really interesting Facebook page and YouTube channel called Omega Point, and he has all sorts of really kind of neat inspirational videos that he puts together himself, and really kind of inspiring stuff. And today we have a really interesting guest who I'm very excited to interview. And we were brought together by a mutual friend, the Roger Killen, as he calls himself on Twitter, and he is the producer of TEDx Stanley Park. And we're actually be collaborating and interviewing several of his TEDx Stanley Park guests to help promote it and also help get their story out there a little bit more. And today we have Dr. Gurdeep Parhar. He is the Executive Associate Dean of Clinical Partnerships and Professionalism for the Faculty of Medicine at the University of British Columbia and is internationally renowned expert in diversity and professionalism. Would you like to add anything to that?
No, that sounds like a pretty good start. Yeah.
It does sound like a pretty good start. And today I wanted to get into a little bit about the topic of your speech at TEDx Stanley Park, which is why culture should be banned. And that's a pretty big statement.
It is.
It is. And maybe before we get into that, you can tell us a little bit about your personal history, your background,
Sure.
And what got you to where you are today.
Yeah, fantastic. So I grew up in northern BC, and I did my medical training in Calgary, then at Royal Columbian Hospital in New Westminster. And it might help to understand why I'm talking about this topic. Just to tell you a little bit about what happens to me at fancy dinner parties or cocktail parties. So I'll be having a pretty good time and maybe having a glass of apple juice. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And somebody will come up to me and somebody will say, tell me about your culture. And you have to remember, I've been in northern BC. I grew up in Kitimat, right on the tip of the Alaskan Panhandle. And my first memories are in northern BC, West Coast BC. And so they'll say, and usually it's a white person, a very nice, friendly, curious white person who'll say, tell me about your culture. And immediately I'll say, well, street hockey, ice fishing or salmon fishing, and Bryan Adams. Right? That's clearly my culture. And my partner, who's often a bit more astute at reading the room, kicks me under the table or pinches me and hits me on the side. And I said, oh, sorry, that's not really what you expect me to say. What you expect me to say is I'm an expert on samosas, the Taj Mahal, and the Kama Sutra. and you know that I was going to demonstrate all three of those on your program. So no, I'm just kidding. I'm sure that...
we would welcome that. And we have video if you'd like to.
And I'm not sure which way your ratings would go if I demonstrated all three of those, especially the third one. But the comment there is that, because I'm of Indian descent, speak Punjabi, Hindi, grew up in a South Asian family, that as soon as somebody sees me, you immediately have some preconceived notions about who I am and what I'm an expert in. And so when I look at culture and I'm thinking about how we use the word culture, what I'd like to do is challenge our thinking on that. And so specifically, I'm thinking about things. When you say culture, what do you immediately think of? I think some of us think about head coverings. We think of spicy food. Might think of an exotic language. Might think about somebody who's of a different religion than us. Those are the things that come to mind. And it's interesting because those things could be part of culture, but culture is different than that. It's maybe not all. Culture is bigger and perhaps a bit more unique than that. When I say culture, we all have culture. I'm a physician by training, so there's a medical culture. So when I'm with my doctor friends, there's a certain culture. It doesn't matter which country they come from, what years of training. There's a certain culture. You have an office here in Gastown, and if you were to go to any place in the world and we talked about Gastown, people would say there's that certain ambiance of Gastown. We're in Vancouver, so I can't not put in a plug for the Canucks that are playing tonight. We have a hockey culture. Right, so we have a healthy sometimes debate and challenge between cultures, a Calgary Flames culture and a Vancouver culture. So culture, the way that the academics define it is that culture is defined as a common experience, right? And so in a way, when you say you have a certain culture, what you're doing is you're defining yourself with a group or a geography or ethnicity, and that's interesting. So when you're defining yourself with a certain group, so there's a couple of things. One is I think culture is misunderstood. So when that person asked me about culture, they weren't really asking about culture. They were saying, "Tell me something Indian," right? Because they assumed that I belonged to and I would know everything about India. So first thing is I think it's misunderstood. Second, I think it's a bit divisive, right? So when I self-identify as belonging to a culture, I'm actually saying I belong to this culture because I have a similar something to do with that culture. It might be a history, it might be a difficult history. It might be a certain type of music. But in doing that, and that's okay, I think people need to belong, right? But having said that, in a way, by saying I belong to a culture, I'm saying I don't belong to yours. Mm-hmm. Right? And that's the problem I have with culture, is I think it's actually quite divisive. I think it says to us, yes, I'm a Vancouver Canuck, and that means I'm not something else. So there's healthy cultural sort of, like I said, competitions. The hockey one's probably a good one.
Yeah.
It could be in cricket, could be football, could be. So I think those are quite healthy competitions. Where it gets into a problem is that it ends up dividing us and saying I am belonging to this group, and therefore I'm not belonging to another one. Mm-hmm. And certainly with some of the news that's happened over the last little while with some of the atrocities in parts of the world, there are people that saying, I belong to this, and it's this group that's actually done this awful and violent thing. So I guess there's probably about 2 or 3 things when I say, why should we ban culture? One is I think it's misunderstood. Second is I think it tends to divide. And the third is I think it actually enforces stereotypes, right?
Yes.
And how many times have we run into someone or met someone and been stunned by what we thought was their culture? And your question at the beginning was interesting because you asked, how did I get into this? As a physician and as a teacher of doctors and physiotherapists and midwifery students, I'm often asked to go in and give a talk on, cultural diversity. People say, and quite appropriately, they say, when I'm dealing with a patient from another group that I'm not a part of, how can I not disrespect them? How can I meet their needs properly? And so when they're asking me to go in to give a talk on culture, they're actually doing it with the best of intentions. They're saying, if somebody's dressed in a certain way or they belong to this faith, what do I need to think about so I don't upset them, so I can be the best care provider? And so for years and years, I've probably given hundreds of these talks. I was giving talks on, if somebody comes from this part of the world, this is what you've got to think about. If somebody's wearing this kind of clothing, this is what you have to think about. And it was interesting, I was sitting with my partner who actually has a PhD in sociology. And at one point she looked over at me and she says, just wondering, what makes you an expert in culture? And I thought, my training is in medicine. And I said, you're right, it's because I'm brown. Being brown, I should be actually an expert in culture. I should speak every language, and I should be able to define spicy food of any background. Yeah. And I should be an expert in all world religions, right? And so she kind of laughed at me, and that's a stereotype in itself. Does that sort of start to, as you can tell, being from the university, I don't have any shortage of words. So
and that's great for the podcast for sure. Yeah, definitely. 'Cause I guess that jumps to me right off the bat is when you start mentioning that you're part of a particular culture, it starts creating that kind of them versus us kind of mentality right off the bat, and I guess that could be where some of the danger lies. Would you agree with that?
That's absolutely it. Is that as soon as you say I identify, and we have groups that have had difficult histories. So, whether you want to talk about the African Americans or you want to talk about our Jewish Canadian friends, and is that they've had difficult histories and challenging histories. So they want to be able to associate with someone else who's had that same history for support, for understanding, and I don't disagree with that. But in doing so, when we do associate with a particular group, we're actually differentiating ourselves from everyone else. And sometimes, arguably, it has purpose and it's valuable, but a lot of times what it really does is it divides us. And the other part around this, you might be amused by this, is when I'm giving talk, especially to students and students that are going overseas. As you said, your brother's in Peru right now.
Yes.
And when I'm speaking to students and I say, you're going to be going to this part of Africa or this part of Asia, and when you go there, you have to get these vaccinations, and you've got to watch your water, drinking this kind of water, and when you're there, you've got to dress in this manner so you don't upset people or start a riot and so forth. And it'll be interesting as I'm doing this. I'm doing it to a diverse group of students. And I'll never forget the time 2 women came up to me, they were white Canadian, came up to me and said, Dr. Parhar, this is way too complicated. We're white, we come from, we're born and raised in Canada, we don't have culture. And I thought it was fascinating that to them, they had simplified culture to be something that only people of color had, or people who weren't white Canadian had. And yes, you've got, you could be from Calgary, you could be from Winnipeg, you've got culture. And I guess this is the other challenge with it, is that because it's a common experience, and as I said, you've got a sports culture, we've got a professional culture, we've got a geographical culture, is that in a way, it's everything. We all have culture, and it's one of those things that when it's everything, it's the air around you, it's the air that you breathe and the water that you drink. If it's everything, is it anything at all?
Yeah, and that's a very good question. So many people identify with their culture. That's part of who they are. That could be part of the reason why they're they're trying to figure out you. I think when they ask you a question, what's your culture, they're trying to figure out, who are you, what are you about, so it is a useful tool potentially that way. But can you get into a little bit about how or why it creates, again, going back to that kind of us versus them mentality, and what dangers kind of lie in that?
Absolutely, and just to preface this, I'm being provocative by saying we should ban culture. What we should probably be doing is banning our use of the word culture, right? So when we talk about, when I'm saying I want you, your brother's in Peru right now, I want you to go out and experience different religions. I want you to speak different languages. I want you to try different types of food. Heck, I want you to wear different types of clothing. I encourage all that. I think that's fabulous. I think that's what everyone should do. But when we're talking about that, when we're saying, my culture is this, just think to yourself, what are you really meaning by that? So I did a little experiment on myself. Like I said, I interact with students and patients on a regular basis. I decided for a month not to use the word culture. And it was fascinating. So I'll give you an example. We were talking to the students about the appropriateness of shaking hands. As you're going to be future physicians, when you walk into a room, should you shake the patient's hand? And it's a Western norm to do that. It's a sign of respect. It's a sign of connection. But then there's other situations where you may not. And as a medical doctor, we know that bacteria and viruses get passed from hand to hand. So, when there's an epidemic or an outbreak, should you really be shaking hands or should you not be? So it is an interesting debate. And a student put up his hand and he said, but Dr. Parhar, in some cultures, they don't shake hands. And I said, well, what do you mean by cultures? Well, what I mean is, some people of a certain religious background wouldn't shake hands. I said, well, let's talk about a religious background. Right. Let's not say culture. And so sometimes because the word is so nebulous and so big, we by not saying what you're actually saying, which is language or religion or dress or food, I think it gets a little bit lost. So your specific question was around why is it dangerous? And I think why it's dangerous is often I think it gets misunderstood. So when we say, I couldn't communicate with this person because there's a cultural barrier. There's a culture barrier. There's a language barrier, right? Yeah. And really, if you think about it, what's the barrier there? In your field, with this wonderful float treatment system that you have set up. When somebody comes in here, why are they here? They're here for health. They're here for peace. They're here for a break. They're here to detoxify. They're here for a lot of reasons. If somebody's from another group and they're coming here, guess what? They're probably coming for similar things. Yeah. And so the other part of this is that we're not that different. Our religion might be different, our skin color might be different, and so our needs and our goals aren't that different. So if I can tell you just my background in religion, I grew up in a Sikh family. We celebrated, because of the community up north, we celebrated every Sikh celebration and every Hindu celebration. I celebrated everything Christian as we were growing up. Can't think of any Christian holiday we didn't celebrate. Most of my staff are actually Muslim, and it was interesting when my daughter was they're teenagers now, but when she was starting preschool, I'd actually put her in a Jewish preschool. And my staff came over to me because I was looking at this piece of paper. They said, Dr. Parhar, what are you doing? And I said, I'm trying to figure out how to make these kosher snacks. And they all laughed and said, we need to break it to you. You're not Jewish. And I said, I know I'm not Jewish, but I have, I actually quite like the fact in Vancouver, I can have all these different experiences. And if you come to my house, there's probably 6 Buddha statues, right? And so I don't have any problem with and actually encourage the diversity and actually learning. My concern is that when we capture it and use it all as one common entity to say we're so much different than everyone else, and it's the divisiveness that really bothers me, and it's a stereotyping. It's the stereotyping that also goes with that. One of the stories I'll quickly share with you is, even as a physician, is I'm early in practice, and now there's a shortage of physicians, but back then there wasn't, and we were trying to build our practices, and this woman came in with her husband, and she had abdominal pain. So I dutifully took my history and interviewed her. Then at the end of the interview, I said, well, I'm going to give you this gown to put on, and I'm going to step out, and could you put this gown on so I can do an exam? And her husband said, nope, you can't touch her. And I said, why? And he said, well, because we belong to this faith. And I said, well, how am I going to find out what's wrong with her if I don't examine her? I don't know, but you're not going to touch her. You're a male. And then I said, well, how's this going to go? And I'm so all stressed and beads of sweat on my forehead. And then he says, well, what about that woman out front? I said, my secretary? And I just started my practice. And to this day, I'm not convinced she even passed secretary school. And I said, I'm pretty sure she couldn't examine your abdomen. But I really don't think, even if she could, that would be right. And we didn't have a female doctor, and my partner in that day was off that day. But even if she had been there, she probably wouldn't have been great about taking this referral. And so eventually I found a doctor down the street who was a good friend, and she said, Gurdeep, don't worry, I'll see the patient. Next week, a woman comes in dressed almost the same way as this first patient, and she had right-sided chest pain, and she was on her own, wasn't with a partner. I don't know if that makes any difference. But she comes in and she says, I've got right-sided chest pain. I thought, okay, you know what, I've been through this. I am now culturally competent. And so I say to her, I said, listen, before I waste your time and I waste my time, after I talk about your right-sided chest pain, I'm going to have to do an exam, just to tell you. And she says, and if you don't do an exam, how are you going to find out what's wrong with me? And what she was thinking was, if you don't do an exam, how are you going to find out what's wrong with me, you idiot? It was what she was thinking, because she's thinking, I'm going to a doctor, why wouldn't you examine me?
Yes.
But I had thought that because of the experience the week before, I understood this entire group. And there was a danger right there. I could have undertreated her. I already misunderstood her. And there's a danger right there. And so, in fact, sometimes when we are trying to become culturally more competent or culturally educated, are we really? And really what we're doing is we're as you put it really nicely, Andy, you said, we're trying to understand. And I think that's human nature. You want to understand. I think we're trained to recognize patterns, right? Somebody walks towards you and they're looking in a certain way. You immediately go, I bet you they're of this faith. I bet you they speak this language. And certainly as a physician I am. Somebody comes towards me and they're a little larger in size. What do? I'm trained to recognize patterns. So I say, well, I've got to check this person for arthritis in the knees, and I wonder if she has high cholesterol, and I've got to check her blood pressure, and I hope she doesn't have heart disease, and she probably has sleep apnea. I'm thinking about all these things. And I have to recognize that that's a pattern that I've been trained to recognize. But if it turns out that when I check her blood pressure or cholesterol and it's normal, that we call it an unconscious bias. That unconscious bias has to be thrown out, because then I've got to say, okay, that's not a problem. I've got to deal with this. And so that's sort of what happens when we see people or we interact with people. We already have these patterns, and I think that's the way our brains work. And there's nothing wrong with that. I think we all need to say we recognize people and patterns. It's kind of like my friends or colleagues will say, Gurdeep, I don't know why you go on and on about cultural and diversity. I don't see color. I treat everybody the same. And I said, you don't see color? And I said, no, I treat everybody the same. I actually don't see that people are different. And I said, if you don't see color, you should really go see an eye doctor. Because that's a problem. Because and in fact, even that statement, and I know what they're trying to say, is they're saying we treat everybody equitably. And it's a great sort of parenthood type statement. But the truth of it is that we do see people differently, and not recognizing that you do lets you be influenced by your subconscious and unconscious. And really what we need to do is put that on the table. I've had this experience with somebody who looked like you before, and I need to recognize that I've had that, and that's what's coloring, if I can use that term. That's what's influencing my opinion of you. But when you start talking, and I realized, no, you don't like banger music and you like country music. I need to now adjust my view that you like country music. My dad drives an F-150 truck. He's a retired welder, and as opposed to banger music, he has country music blazing from his truck, right? And you can imagine how funny that probably looks, right? He's about my skin color, and so people are going, and they'll have to come to me and say, "I think your gardener's playing country music." And first of all, he's not my gardener; he's my dad. But secondly, he likes country music. And so I guess having patterns isn't an issue, and recognizing patterns isn't it. We just need to continue questioning them.
And I think that's a tough one. I mean, when you talk about subconscious biases, are you even aware of those subconscious biases?
By definition, you're not, if it's subconscious. Right?
Yes, exactly. So you propose basically changing the frame of how we look at culture, or the word culture in particular, and just trying to not put people in a box, not label them based on your assumptions or what they tell you about their culture, because it could cause a danger. For example, that woman, if you do not check her properly, she could have some kind of medical issue, and it might have gone completely overlooked because of that assumption you would have made. So let's say, how do we get past all of that? How do we get past the cultural biases, the subconscious biases that we have?
Great question. So when you're communicating and you're thinking you want to use the word culture, substitute it with something else, right? And so, for example, you pick up a newspaper and it's a cultural newspaper. Well, is it a cultural newspaper? It's a Cantonese newspaper. It's a Mandarin newspaper. It's a Punjabi newspaper. You are interested in type of food and you say, feel like going out. So be careful with the word you're using and be specific about what you're actually talking about. And I think that in itself will be a big leap forward. And second is when you're saying you identify with a culture, that's like I said, I have no problem with that, and I think it's okay to identify with the culture. Just be careful then you're not dividing yourself from another group. And I think that's the way forward on this, is that a lot of the hostilities and the violence that's happening in the world, so something absolutely horrid happens in Paris, and what's the reaction? A mosque burns in Ontario, right? And so all of a sudden this group, and again, I don't have evidence that they were directly related, but there's nothing to say that anybody who belonged to this group at the mosque had anything to do with or even partly believed in what happened in Paris, right? And I think that's a great example of where somebody who says that they belong to this group has done something that's quite violent, and now everybody else who I think belongs to that group must be thinking the same way. Right, and that's where we go down this path where there's no turning back from that. And I think that's the challenge. My friends, using the mosque example, my friends that are Islamic will say their entire belief system is extremely peaceful and anti-violent. Right, so their belief, and they're devout Muslims, will say, I actually don't believe in any violence, and so I can't condone it for in whoever's name it's said to have occurred. And so I guess what I'm saying is that, and it's not just us speaking, Andy, it's actually media and others perpetuate it, right? And again, it goes back to trying to recognize and recognize and almost cubbyhole someone and saying, I understand you, you must be this, right? And I think there's the challenge, right?
Yeah. That's exactly, when you say cubbyhole, what I was getting from the distinction you were making was that compartmentalization that happens when you are, say, noticing some patterns, maybe in a person's appearance, language, things like this. And then, overlaying that with all the history that you have to say, well, maybe either this person is foreign, there's a distance there, versus getting to the foundation nature of the human experience that both of these people are having that happen to speak different languages, maybe have different customs, traditions, but why have to have such a cognitive separation between the two, which is something that I was forced to kind of examine when traveling a few years back in Africa, from living in Vancouver, like Tri-Cities and things like that for several years, and then being immersed completely in a very different what I would have called culture at the time. And then having spent some time there and just realizing that there's just so many very complex and different ways that humans exist on this planet, speak different languages, different religions, and not having to make that mean that there is one being the correct kind of center of your experience and then saying, oh, this is different or wrong or something of that nature. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think when you get to the core of what we all want, I'd be hard pressed to think about anybody. You give examples from Africa, your brothers in Peru, I travel in other parts of the world. Who doesn't want, a safe place to live? Mm-hmm. Who doesn't want the best things for their partner and their kids? Who doesn't want good shelter? Who doesn't want good food? Doesn't want good education? Like, I think when you think about our common values, we actually there are a lot of common ones, and I think it's going to get trickier for subsequent generations. With the melding of ethnicities, right? So I guess because I was in this country since I was a year old, technically my kids, who are teenagers now, would be, I guess, second generation. My partner's third generation. So it's really interesting. My kids, who are about my skin color, maybe a little bit more tan than I am, they'll be asked at their school, so where are you from? And it would just be kind of complicated, because they'd start by saying, well, my dad came when he was a year old, and my mom's grandfather came, and so they'd have to explain this whole thing, and it really was 3 paragraphs later. And so my daughter got a bit fed up with this, and so when somebody says, no, where are you from? She says now, this will happen in Vancouver, and she'll say, well, I'm from BC Children's Hospital. It's on Oak Street. You might have heard of it. And, but it's sort of saying, I'm from here. And yes, when I'm at home, I speak Punjabi, and Grandma and Grandpa take us to the Sikh temple, and we celebrate Diwali, which is a Hindu festival, and the Sikh festival. And yes, my name is actually, she has an Arabic name that often is mixed up for being Muslim. And she says, yes, I've got this sort of eclectic being that I am, but I can't be, as you said, Chris, I can't be compartmentalized, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's such a big issue right now with things that are happening in the world. And it's really, I guess it's kind of sad, but also interesting at the same time, how people are handling the situation. And you're seeing so many sides speak on so many different issues around these kind of topics right now. In a situation like what's happening in the Middle East and what just happened in France, in your opinion, how can you prevent or potentially prevent that from escalating and getting worse and inflaming the situation, like having more animosity towards a particular race or religion or culture? What can be done to prevent that from just becoming more inflamed?
Yeah, and brilliant challenge, and obviously it's not one that we're going to solve tonight, but I think it's one that we need to think about. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is that it goes back to this whole stereotyping and generalizing, is that when there is a segment, and there will always be some segment of any group that is just way out there in their, I'll say, extremism, and they're just way out there, and it can be from a certain geographical group, it can be from a certain religious group, and it wouldn't have mattered if you had transposed them to another group. They would still be just way out there, and their views on humanity and violence and gender equity just would not be acceptable. And so when you look at so when you say, or you ask, well, why do these problems happen and how do we solve them, is first of all to recognize that anybody who creates or does those harmful things, think of them as individuals. You should not be thinking about an entire country. It'd be somebody sort of saying to me, why aren't you a top scorer in ice hockey? Well, I was a lousy skater, right? They put me between the defenseman and the goalie as I was growing up, and I'm pretty sure that wasn't a position. But I'm teasing, is that, that would be somebody sort of saying, well, why don't you know my good friend who's in Toronto? Well, that's a country away. So I think likewise, when we see things that happen around the world, and they happen in a way that none of us can really understand, is to not to accept that is that entire wide group. Because as soon as you start saying that, then the other people start saying, well, they're being picked on unfairly, and then they have to put up their defense mechanisms as well. And then they'll have to do something to, it's the eye for an eye type of comment. Mm-hmm. And then it doesn't stop. So I think what we need to do is, when there are unacceptable behaviors, recognize them as unacceptable behaviors and stop them, right? But not to say that this is something that's wider than that. Because it's there are attributes to a wider group, because that's when wars start. right? And we've had atrocities in the past. You can only think back to Hitler and what happened in that time, at that time in Germany, was saying we're different than this group, we're better than this group, and so we're going to support our group and not that group. And that's really where some of the worst things that have happened in human history have happened, when there's been these big divides. And it wasn't just one person, there were groups of people who did this. Right.
Yeah.
And so when you think about the hundreds of wars going on in the world right now, it's not one versus one. That would be, that would be a bar brawl. That would be a boxing match. The fact that so many people are doing this means that they've somehow gotten into these weird big groups, and think that they have so much in common that they're going to battle another big group, right? And that really shouldn't be happening.
Yes. Yeah, it speaks to, again, I think a little bit of that self-identification, and I'm part of this team and you're part of that team, and allows them to, in some way or another, dehumanize the other team, which allows them to go and kill people in other countries, right?
Because you don't value them as much as you do people in your own group.
Exactly, exactly, and that is definitely the danger. And where does it all stem from? So you say it's culture, but it must go deeper than that, than the individual, to motivate somebody to be able to go and really cause harm to another group.
Yeah, that's you're looking at what is that sort of deep core, sort of dark place that humans are at, where you can actually think that way and behave that way. I think part of it is whatever their experience was. If there was something that they experienced that they just can't be able to forgive or forget. And then the other part is just miscommunication and misunderstanding, right? Like, I think that a lot of people will do things because they think that this group is totally against them, or if they don't annihilate them, they'll get annihilated. Mm-hmm. And, when you think about, you mentioned the Middle East, but other parts of the world, and there's kids fighting kids. It's like, what could they possibly have against another group of kids, right? And so you're right. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I don't know what is it that drives you to that level of violence or hate. But I'm telling you that at the end of the day, if you were to put these two people on a deserted island, they probably wouldn't have that much uncommon. They'd probably have a lot more in common.
Yes.
And somebody's often asked me and said, Gurdeep, you should remind people that as a doctor or somebody who's been in training, I can tell you, when I look inside a cadaver, or I look inside a human body in the operating room, not that different. Blood's blood.
Yeah.
Right? It's if you think about the stuff that we attribute as culture, the stuff on the outside, the skin color, the language, the headdress, the food, the dance, it's actually pretty external. Yes. Right? Mm. It's pretty external. It's not a lot of stuff inside. And the stuff that is inside of value, like our belief in humanity, our spirituality, all those types of things, they're probably not that different.
Absolutely, for sure. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit right now and talk about your TEDx Stanley Park talk, and that is, you could have chosen any subject to speak on at that venue. Why this one? Why are you so passionate about this particular topic?
And I think it's a reflection to where I've gotten to in life. I've been teaching for numbers of years, and like I said, I often do get called in to speak about cultural diversity, and without even being a real expert on sociology and so forth. And it's my point of, I guess, enlightenment is saying, what have I been doing over these years? I've been teaching about culture, and really what I've been doing is ingraining stereotypes. I've been when I go to an audience and I say, somebody comes from this part of the world, this is what you've got to think about, or these are the things you've got to do to be a better, television host, to be a better lawyer, to be a better doctor. Really what I'm doing is I'm teaching some shortcuts which could actually be leading to a whole bunch of misunderstandings. So my need now to explode that, if I can say that in that way, is to say that I don't know if that thinking is actually the right way to go. Like, I think what we need to do is say there are some patterns. I don't know if we should be teaching those patterns. The patterns are going to exist, as we already said, because they're subconscious and they're there. But we need to be constantly challenging those patterns. And that's what's made me sort of reflect on my own behaviors over the last little while and say, when I'm thinking about culture, is it really culture that I'm thinking about? And is it, and by talking about it, am I actually just dividing things even more? I'll tell you something humorous that happened to me. It was when the Dalai Lama came into Vancouver. and one of the local newspaper, it was sort of like when David Suzuki comes in or does something, that the whole issue is everything to do with the environment. So, sports and the environment, business and the environment. So the Dalai Lama was coming in, so everything had to do with spirituality. So there was, spirituality in business, and spirituality in food, and spirituality and, news, and so forth, and education. And they wanted to do this piece on spirituality and health. And in this organization I was in, they said, would you mind going to talk to them? And I said, really? Like, what part of spirituality and health do you think I'm at all an expert in? So the joke I made is, I said, it's clearly because I'm the only brown guy in the room. I said, you expect me to be an expert on spirituality now? And all joking aside, I said, okay, fine, I'll go talk to the reporter.
Yeah.
And it was interesting. So she sits down. It was one of our major newspapers, and she sits down. The first question, she puts her recorder in the middle of the room, and she says, "So, Dr. Parhar, do you pray?" And I jumped up to the recorder, and I turned it off. And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, I'm the Dean of Equity and Diversity at the medical school, and I just can't possibly answer that question and be able to function normally the next day." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Well, if I say I don't, then everybody who has any sort of faith is going to say, this guy's some freaky atheist, right? And if I say I do, then anybody who thinks that religion doesn't exist is going to say, okay, he's some freaky, he's a religious fanatic." And so it's kind of interesting. I've been put in those points in my life where all these misunderstandings can happen, and very easily happen. And so to your question about why this topic, I think that we need to be talking about it more. I think the worst thing to do is to think it's kind of awkward, whether it's about religion or whatever else. So even that white person that I started saying in the beginning who said, "Tell me about your culture," I'm quite excited to ask about the culture. I don't think they were prepared for the answer I gave.
Yeah.
And so maybe I should have said, and the best part of the last, 2-3 years was I finally did get to meet Bryan Adams in a restaurant, right? And that was my quote unquote cultural experience,
Nice.
right? But
Nice.
you probably wanted to hear what, it's Kama Sutra aside now, but that I did go to the Taj Mahal, and I did, yes, see the white, white stones and so forth and so forth. And so I think constantly learning about it is important, but I think that the term culture, I think we've come to a point now where it's, in a way, when we use it, it's almost meaningless. And I grew up in the 70s and 80s where it was all about multiculturalism, right? And I remember saying, well, we've got to celebrate our differences. Yeah, it's absolutely wonderful. I remember actually, growing up in the North, we'd have these big, massive high school potlucks. So it wasn't just your classroom, it was the entire school, and it was a gymnasium. And everybody was supposed to bring their dish. And so I grew up through that era. And again, fantastic. I can't think of 2 nights in a row where my family eats food from the same country, so totally into the diversity. I don't have a problem with that. You were talking about tacos earlier and pizza and so forth. And it's a good country song that talks about all the different foods you can eat. But having said that, you probably know the song. But having said that, we just need to be sure that when we're using the term culture, we're not actually doing more harm, and that's the message.
And that does make a lot of sense. You're speaking to an audience that would, I think, be very much interested in this topic. And have you ever heard of Terence McKenna? Terence McKenna, he was an author, speaker, philosopher of type, and he was very big on the idea that culture is not your friend. And I think it speaks to a lot about what you're saying right now. It can act as a mechanism to divide us if we're not careful, right? So I'm trying to think of another question I can ask you along these lines.
Well, that is an interesting point there too. What I was just thinking in Terence's idea, this simple idea of awareness, which seems like the solution that you're providing is to simply become aware of these patterns within yourself. Therefore, you can actually diffuse that the charge that's in some of that there. So even in your the fact that you're speaking about this, in the education of it, in amplifying the conversation in the collective mind, you will, or just in our city or across the world. Hopefully whoever's listening to this, whoever sees your talk, that notion, that idea of becoming aware of these patterns, it's going to be a slow process for sure, maybe even slower in some other parts of the world. There's more charge in that separation. But it certainly seems that you were talking very much to that point, and that's kind of what you're alluding to.
Yeah, absolutely. And if I can give you a little challenge, other than, okay, so one was don't use the word culture. You replace that word with something else the next time you're thinking of using the word culture, and you'll find that you're informing the person you're talking to in a much higher level. It will be language, it will be religion, it will be clothing, it will be something else. The second is, if you see somebody, and we're going by visuals now, and arguably it could be hearing someone, it could be eating a different type of food, go up to them. Go up to them and make it your mission to find one thing in common with them, really in common with them, right? And I can tell you that in that conversation, it won't be more than 2 or 3 sentences in, right? But when we see them across the street, or we run into them at a pub, at a library, in some social setting, we'll say that that person's a bit not of my culture. That person's a bit different. You may not be saying that out loud. Your subconscious will be separating you. And I encourage you to go up to them and say something. And whether it's the taxi driver, the steward, the waitress, your barber, whoever it is, I can guarantee you there'll be a lot in common. And I think if we started even at that micro level doing that, you'd find that when you talk about the hostilities and the divisiveness that happens in the world, there wouldn't be. There wouldn't be at all. When I'm thinking about my trips. We're talking about your brother in Peru. I get out of a cab in Bali. The person next to me is from Turkey, and he says, "What part of Turkey are you from?" And I said, "Actually, I'm not from Turkey, but thank you. I think that's a." And I said, "Yeah, I'll take that as a compliment." And I said, "Why did you think I was from Turkey?" He said, "Tone of your skin." And I said, "Okay." And I guess what I'm saying is that even physically, sometimes we get mistaken for others and other groups, and that's okay. And in fact, what people are doing there is just saying, "Hey, you're not that different than me." And I think that's neat. I mean, it wasn't too long ago that in Britain, in England, their national food is officially butter chicken.
There you go.
Right? It's actually butter chicken is their national food now. I tell this story sometimes about kilts, and my partner was giving a talk in Scotland. In sociology and education, and I was not part of the conference, so I decided I'd go wander around in the city in Glasgow, and I wandered into the equivalent of a Harry Rosen suit store, but it was for kilts. And I wandered in, and the fellow said, he said, "Are you looking for your family's tartan?" And I said, "I don't think my family has a tartan." And he says, "Well, maybe your family doesn't, but let me show you the Sikh tartan." I said, "There's a Sikh tartan, like a Punjabi Sikh tartan?" And he says, "Yes, there is." And I actually went, and long story short is I bought it. I bought the tie and the entire kilt. And it's an interesting story behind this, and it goes to belonging and commonality. This fellow who's a philanthropist, so he's done very, very well financially, wears a turban, has a beard, and he's spent most of his life in Scotland. He actually took a lot of, is it Robbie Burns? Took a lot of Robbie Burns literature and converted it to Punjabi. This is how dedicated. He's trying to now rename the airport where he lives in Scotland to the Robbie Burns Airport. But looking at him, he looks like he's right out of Punjab, right? Like he's still looking very traditional Sikh. So him and his wife were giving awards at this little elementary school. And all these kids were lined up, and they were wearing their kilts because it was the awards day. And these 4 brown South Asian kids, South Asian descent, were not. They were wearing the school uniform. And so this fellow looks over at the headmaster, and he says, why are these kids not wearing their tartans? Why are they different? Why are they wearing the school uniform and the other kids are wearing their kilts? He says, well, they don't have a family tartan because they're immigrants to Scotland. And he went back and he said, that's not right. And so what he did was he went through all the right processes in Scotland, and it's a big deal to register a tartan. So it's almost like passing a legislation. So it went through all these different levels of government. So he actually registered a Sikh tartan. And to him, the underlying principle was, I have been in Scotland my whole life. I feel I'm Sikh, but I'm also Scottish, right? And so it goes back to the similarity. So this fellow has, a matching Sikh turban, the kilt, and everything else, and it goes back to the similarities. He says, yes, I belong to this religious group, and I'm a Sikh, but at the same time, I'm also Scottish. And why shouldn't I have a tartan?
Yeah.
Right? That was just such a powerful story for me. I've yet to figure out where I'm going to wear the kilt, to be honest. I've yet to find a function. But it was interesting because it also talks about belonging and similarities. Right?
Yeah. I wonder why, maybe you can elaborate on this a little bit more. When you said, challenge you to go out and speak to somebody and find that similarity. You probably find it pretty quick, right?
Right.
For myself, I'm actually more interested in the differences. I want to know what makes us different, why we're different. But I think that would make a lot of people uncomfortable? Or why do you think it is that some people want to find a similarity as opposed to a difference?
So when I say try to find a similarity, what I'm trying to, I'm starting with the premise that you think you're different than them. And if you think you're different than them, you may be, and there may be things that are different, and that's wonderful. It's the whole celebrate diversity thing. But also remember that there's probably things in common. So do make an effort to find something in common. But you're right. I think if everybody was the same as you, boy, this world would be a boring place, right? Mm-hmm. The whole point is, okay, well, hey, I can listen. So what are you listening to? Here, listen to this type of music. So I would encourage you to also explore the differences. I'm not saying not to, mm-hmm. but I think we get so fixated on how different someone is than us that we don't remember that, we're all Canucks, we're all this, or we're all that. Mm-hmm. And I think that, so my comment there, absolutely. I think, why would we travel if we weren't interested in experiencing things that were different than us? Why wouldn't we go into some restaurant eating food that we'd never eaten before? I mean, that's a whole thing about life, is you want to be able to experience those diverse things and learn from them, right? But having said that, I think people are too quick to find differences. It always not frustrates me, but I always kind of smirk a bit when you get off the airport in some really exotic different place, and there's like a Burger King or a McDonald's attached to the restaurant, to the airport. I'll be thinking, I didn't come here to eat McDonald's. Not to say there's anything against fast food. But I could eat that at home. Mm-hmm. I came here to experience something different. But I'll still see a group of people getting off the plane and
they're going to the Burger King,
and they'll be eating at that same fast food place. And again, nothing wrong with burgers if that's what you like, but you could have eaten that at home.
Yes.
Right. The whole point was to experience something different, right? But they want that same. Well, then they'll complain the ketchup was a bit different. Well, okay, but it's probably made the ketchup kind of different, right?
Yeah.
So the point is, you're absolutely right, Andy. It's not so much that I don't want you to explore the differences and learn from the differences and experience the differences, but it's more that I think it's too easy to identify differences. And this is obviously not for people like yourself. We're keen to learn about people that are not the same as you. Mm-hmm. But I think when you think about the challenges in the world right now, think about, you've seen it on TV, somebody throwing rocks and somebody throwing grenades or some sort of tear gas the other way. If you actually got them into a room and said, okay, let's just calm down. So, let's talk about something else for a moment. There'd probably be tons of similarities. And there have been, I think young people are really good at this, but you've seen young people that have gotten into rooms and said, no, you're right. I can't understand why this war is going on.
Yeah. What do you think it is? And you said you're not a psychologist or a sociologist, but why are differences so threatening or scary to people?
I think it's a comfort zone thing. I think it's one of those situations where when it takes a certain amount of confidence. When you said you want to go up to somebody who looks different and learn from them, and you want to learn how they're different, you're at a point in your life where you're confident doing that. And so one of the challenges I have, if I can throw out one now, is that when I look across a park, or I look across a university campus, or I look across a shopping mall, yes, you'll see people that are different and you'll see diversity. But look really carefully. Often they'll be in tiny little cliques, right? There'll be people that look very similar in one group, and then over on the other end of the food fair, there'll be somebody else and so there'll be diversity, but there won't be diversity this way.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying always, but so have we become more diverse? Well, yeah, if you look at the whole. But if you look at individuals, I'm not sure. And why does that happen? Is I think there is some safety. So people will challenge me on what I just said and say, Gurdeep, well, if somebody feels safe being in the same, I'm South Asian or Indian, so if all my friends are Indian, if I make a joke, they'll probably get it, and I understand Russell Peters. But honestly, who doesn't understand Russell Peters? I mean, I think he offends and makes jokes about absolutely every ethnic group. But somebody will say, I get that because I can understand you because our parents are kind of similar, because we pray at the same place, because we eat similar food. So I think there's a certain kind of comfort zone there, and so I think there is that pull to similar groups, and at a ludicrous or even superficial level, if I'm walking through parts of Europe, I know where to wear certain football jerseys and where not to be, right? Yeah. And I remember going through Spain, and I got off, and I said to the fellow in the store, and I said, I just need the most popular Spanish soccer team's football jersey, and this is it, and that's the player. And I said, cool, because when I walk through the streets of Barcelona, I want people high-fiving me, right?
Well, you have the best chance of getting along with most people there.
There you go.
Yeah.
You know, and if I was in Spain and wearing a French soccer jersey or German one, they'd probably see me as a bit of competition. And I'm saying this in a funny, superficial way, right? It's kind of like being at a Vancouver Canucks game and being the one Boston Bruin there, right?
Yeah. And it seems like we're so culturally or whatever conditioned as human beings to identify with groups, and we see that. So many people identify with I am Canadian, I am a Canucks fan. And use the example of the football jersey. Well, in a way, it's not a lot different from saying I'm a Canadian versus I'm Iranian. Yeah. It's the same kind of that group identification thing. And on a sports team level, it's usually pretty healthy, depending on where you are. Right. Sometimes it probably not healthy. I know in Brazil they have pretty big riots over soccer games, right? But then when it's two nations, all of a sudden you could potentially be getting into wars. Right, and it's again that identification with that particular group. I'm different from you, therefore, for some reason, I can look down upon you. I dehumanize you a little bit, so it's okay for me to go and drop bombs on your city. So that's where it scales up to.
That's exactly it. On the macroscopic level, that is the worst case scenario, right? Because we're seeing us as being too different. And I'm going to suggest to you that by using culture in that even the word culture in that nebulous way, we're identifying differences. Just the idea of saying you identify with one group means that you're saying you're separate from another one. Otherwise, you wouldn't say you're part of a group, right? And so so inherent in that identifying with a group is distinction, and that's where I'm saying we need to rethink that a bit. So you're right. So in sports and in other ways, it's probably healthy. But it gets to a bit of a level. I was in India during the cricket competition, and it was when they lost, India lost. People were throwing television sets out their windows, right? Nearly. They were rioting, and they were talking about corruption, and we have to change the government, right? It happens in Vancouver. We have to change the government. Yeah. So even sports can get to a level where that competition, that identification, isn't healthy. Right?
All right, so how do we maybe deprogram, if you will, people from that whole theme of group identification? It's so prevalent, and it seems very natural almost, actually, because I'm part of my tribe, you're part of your tribe, and these are the people who are in my family, and I want to protect my family. How do we move forward from this whole idea of group identification and just recognize that we're probably more similar than we are different? And how can we move past this?
I think the first part, and we touched on earlier, is recognizing that subconscious, right? Recognizing, and don't put it in the subconscious. When we make decisions that are based on our subconscious, we're going to make bad decisions. Yeah. Just put them up front and put them on the table. There's been lots of research done on this, and so often in the U.S. context, it's African Americans versus white Americans. And what they'll do is that they'll take a video clip, much like what we're recording now. They'll do a video clip with a sound, with it, and they'll replace the video of the African American then with the white American, same audio, and then lips are moving. And what they'll do is they'll ask people to evaluate the person's communication skills. Mm-hmm. And the research has shown we will all rate the African Americans' language skills as being lower than the white Americans, even though the audio was the same. Right?
Simply based on how they look.
It's the way they look. Yeah. Studies even in Canada have shown that when we look at CVs and you see a name with a name that's of Chinese descent, you will rate that as differently than you would a name that's of a white Anglo-Saxon descent. And so when I say this, it goes back to my comment earlier about saying, well, I don't see color. No, we do. You do see color. And I'm not saying you're racist if you do. All I'm saying is you need to recognize it. And you need to say, so back to your question, how do we change this? Is saying, this has been my experience with somebody from this group, or this has been the way that I watched a television show, and this is the way they portrayed people of this group. I just need to recognize that that's what I've been told, or that's the way I've been, I've experienced life. And now when somebody's in front of me, they probably don't fit that mold. And I think constantly questioning. And for somebody who teaches diversity and teaches equity and teaches cultural safety, not a single day goes by where I don't refine my notion again of somebody. So going back to the example of shaking hands, I've been in practice 22 years. I can walk into a room and I can tell you now, for the patients I've known for 22 years, I can walk into a room and I can tell you who will be disrespected if I don't shake their hand. Like I can't even start the visit. They'll get up, shake hand, and then sit down, and we can't start. And in fact, if I don't put my hand out, they'll be offended. I also know who, if I put my hand out to, will be offended that I put my hand out. And so I guess what I'm saying is but that didn't happen overnight. I learned that, and I also learned it for this individual. Next room I go into, somebody could be looking exactly the same and from the same, they could even have the same name. And that notion's totally different. And that's what we need to constantly be thinking about, is that what works for one, that generalization doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so because on an individual level, we're misunderstanding people. We're possibly miscommunicating. At a bigger level, that's what leads to wars.
So how can we, how would you say, you mentioned it briefly about questions, but how can we recognize some of those subconscious biases that we have and realize, oh, this is just a generalization I'm making about this person, and then move past that? Because if it's subconscious and you don't even know you're doing it, how would you recommend somebody go about changing some of their patterns of thinking or beliefs?
Yeah, so I think it's very, very individual and situation by situation, right? So if somebody's dressed in a certain way, and for somebody like a physician, I need access, I don't know, to their ear, and they've got their ear covered. I would say, I need to look at your ear. Is it okay if I examine your ear? That's a very basic example. I don't imagine you as a TV host and as an entrepreneur are going to look at people's ears, or you shouldn't. I'm teasing. That in any other context, you might actually go up to them. I think most people, and you have to remember this, somebody who doesn't look, and this is probably a generalization too, somebody who doesn't look mainstream white Canadian is probably used to other people asking them. You're not the first one. We often think, are you the first one to, I'm going to bother them by asking, or I'm going to go up to them and say, ask an awkward question, and they're going to be very, very angry with me. Chances are you're not the first one to have asked them if they've got something unique about them, something in their hair, some piercing, some clothing item, that certain item that they're carrying with them. One of the comments I often, one of the stories I often tell is, as I'm going through the security system, I wear a bracelet, which is part of the Sikh faith, and I can see the security guards doing head spins around this, right, thinking, what are we going to do with this guy, because he's going to set off the metal detector, and I'll be like, would you like me to temporarily take it off? I can temporarily take it off, or I can put it on myself. And people of Sikhism aren't all the same that way. Some will not separate it from their body, and they will want it in their pocket somewhere, and they can, and the security people know how to deal with that. And there's others that will say, no, it's not a problem, I can take it off. But it's interesting, because all I wish somebody would do is come up and ask me. If they would just ask me, I could tell them whether I'm comfortable taking it off or not.
Right.
And it's that fear of offending me, and is the challenge. And there will be somebody says, no, you know what, it's my faith and the teachings of Sikhism is I'm not going to take the karda off, and that's okay. We'll figure out some way to accommodate it. But doing this sort of spin and not asking the question, you're not the first person to have asked them that.
Yes,
and that's something we all need to remember, right?
Yeah, it seems a lot of fear and almost like a overcompensation. And if you simply could just ask the right questions, we could avoid a lot of these problems. But people don't, for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Going to TEDx Stanley Park. Have you ever done a TEDx speech before?
No, I haven't. So I'm looking forward to it. I've seen them, and it's sort of a different format. As a university person, I obviously used to giving lectures and talking, and as you can tell, I don't have any problems talking. But so this will be in a slightly different format. So I'm quite looking forward to it.
Yeah, the TED experience seems like it's a pretty seems pretty prestigious one. I think.
I think so. I think there's some very interesting people who have a lot of very interesting thoughts to share. Are you
going to take them up on their coaching for public speaking, or are you going to just kind of go in there and be like, I'm comfortable, I'm going to go ahead and do my own thing?
I don't know. There's definitely a team around you, and they're very experienced, and they obviously done this several times before. One thing about being an educator is I never forget that I can be educated, right? So There's always somebody that says, Gurdeep, your posture's off, or you talk too fast, or don't use this word and use that word. So definitely ready for feedback. And the other challenge with the TEDx is it's a very tight amount of time. Right, you're only given 12 to 13 or 14 minutes.
Yeah.
And for somebody who's used to giving lectures that are sometimes 3 hours long, yes, they are sometimes. It's how to keep your thoughts organized and be able to deliver in that tight amount of time. That'll probably be the biggest challenge.
Yeah, be really concise and deliver an effective message still, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you definitely have a lot to say. And is there anything else you would like to add tonight? Is there anything else that you want to get out there?
No, I think we've covered most of it. And if I can leave you with one thing, is really think about how culture, and the term culture more specifically, might be dividing us, and do your best to find the similarities amongst each other.
Excellent. Well, Chris, would you like to throw in any more pearls of wisdom into the conversation?
Oh, man. One thing I would like to do to wrap up in the spirit of being open to, other things. I'm actually, right now, I just did it as well. I've been watching myself. The word culture is what I wanted to pop out of my mouth so many times during this conversation, and I divert, and it's kind of caused me to sort of like have some skips in thought. But you were actually speaking about your bracelet, and I'm sure there's a lot of listeners and myself who I'm definitely not schooled or educated at all in your faith. Could you explain a little bit about that bracelet you were talking about?
Sure. So the tenets of the Sikh religion is that when you're a baptized Sikh, there's actually 5 different things that you're asked to follow, and for excuse me, they all start with the letter K. So you'll see Sikhs wearing a kirpan, which is a ceremonial dagger, right? There's the kara, which is the bracelet. There's the kes, which is the hair. So interestingly, it's not the turban, it's the hair underneath the turban. And there's a kanga, which is a comb. So it's a tiny little comb, usually that people wear in their hair. And then there's an undergarment, sort of these, sort of like almost like boxer shorts. They're called kachara. So there's 5 items. And when you're a baptized Sikh, you actually follow all 5 of them. In addition to that, there's a regular ritual of prayers that you follow, and so forth. Many of us don't do all the 5 tenets and aren't baptized Sikhs, so we follow as much as we can, but not necessarily are baptized. And I'm not an expert on Sikhism, but my understanding, at least from my family, on the kara, or the bracelet, is that God doesn't have any beginning or end. It's much like in Christianity, when you look at a wedding band, that it's continuous and eternal. So the idea here is that that there is no beginning or end to this, to your spiritual power that you believe in.
Wow. Well, I think the theme of unity is a perfect note to end the conversation on.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for being a guest on Vancouver Real. And if you're out there listening to us and you're still with us, please, if you like what you hear, go find us on iTunes and give us a review and rating. That would really help. And of course, we're recording out of Float House, 70 West Cordova Street. And that's all we have for tonight, folks. So thank you for being a guest. And I will be in the audience looking forward to hearing your speech.
Great. Thank you. And thank you for having me.
Thanks again.